Eventually, when you look at the questions that have come so far, उसमें most of the questions uh, are dealing macro science के अंदर are dealing with getting the macroeconomic objectives, and for that it makes us discuss the policies that are involved in it. So there are basically five policies that we want to perfect before we go to the exam. There is one essay on it. The first one we need to have perfect clarity about is the fiscal policy. Then it is the monetary policy. Third, we have the supply side policy. Then our discussion goes into protectionism. There's an entire topic on this, protectionism. And ये मॉनेटरी में भी जाता है, लेकिन आप इसको एज अ सेपरेट पॉलिसी भी ट्रीट कर सकते हो. So we basically have five policies with which we are hoping to achieve our macroeconomic objectives. तो जब हम बात करते हैं objectives के अंदर, so we are looking at, if there's space for it. So in our objectives, our first objective is price stability. Then it is about sustainable economic growth. Then it's about achieving full employment. Then we have stability in our balance of payment, mainly. And lastly, it is about equitable distribution of income. For exam purposes, we need to be able to answer how fiscal policy can help us achieve all five of these things and how effective is this policy. Similarly, after that, how monetary policy can achieve these five particular policies. जहां तक फिस्कल और मॉनेटरी की बात है, the thing with these two is, which simplifies a lot of stuff for us, is that these two policies are demand side policies. It shifts your aggregate demand. So the question really is that if we want to increase aggregate demand or we want to decrease the aggregate demand. Okay? And once we know that we are going for expansionary or contractionary के अंदर you try to reduce the AD, expansionary में you try to increase it. तो फिर how fiscal policy with its government spending and taxation, how can we achieve the desired results? Or under monetary policy, it is the money supply and the interest rates and credit regulations also as per banker book. उसके बाद हमारे पास supply side policy hai, which deals with aggregate supply and how you can increase the aggregate supply or reduce the aggregate supply to achieve the objectives. Usually, you want to go for an increase that will sort your problems out. Uske baad, another policy we deal with is protectionism. प्रोटेक्शनिज्म के अंदर एक्सचेंज रेट भी आ जाती है समटाइम्स समटाइम्स एक्सचेंज रेट मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी के अंदर आ सकती है. I'll deal with it separately and then it's up to you how you want to deal with it. But the whole idea of protectionism is that you want to reduce the imports coming into the country and you want to increase the exports. It's mainly focusing on the balance of payment, but since X and M are getting affected, आपको पता है AD के अंदर भी X minus M का component is involved, so protectionism can actually affect aggregate demand as well. And then later on, when we're dealing with these chapters, protectionism and exchange rate, we're going to see कि किस तरीके से we try to affect exports and imports and eventually AD and current account and all of that, and how that can also affect the fundamental objectives that we have. So this is your major मतलब अगर हम टॉपिक की बात करें so this one is one of the major topics. So if I share some of the questions to understand what we're dealing with here. So if we go into the policies, just take a look at the questions that we have in hand here. These are the questions that have so far come in Cambridge. Every year, every variant, plenty of questions. Um, Before we move into like the supply side, you have to know all your policies, the supply side policy, because mostly the question wants you to discuss how it will affect the current account, how it will affect the inflation rate, how it can affect your various macroeconomic objectives, so there's like all sorts of questions and they don't stop. Unemployment, if they're asking you, they're straight up, they're going to ask you contractionary, expansionary policy के बारे में बताएं. अब हमारे जो सेशन में आया है 2024 नवंबर के अंदर, it was about उन्होंने खास बता दिया कि how a policy is likely to solve your structural and your cyclical policies. So they can really, really target uh, questions. So far, almost in every variant, they are putting up a question of this. So this is like one of those major topics that you cannot attempt your Cambridge exam without. ठीक है. So what do we really need to know about all of it? So let's suppose if we talk about the fiscal policy, the first thing we need to realize is fiscal policy basically has two things in it. Okay. It's got the government spending and it has the government's tax revenue. Basically, what it's dealing with is something called the government's budget. Every government has it because every country has a government which has to spend some places, and there is some sort of tax revenue that they collect. So, in short, government spending की जब हम बात करते हैं, this government spending is also part of aggregate demand. By the way, C plus I plus G. So when we're talking about government spending, we have to be mindful that we are talking about government spending on all sorts of expenditure that the government does. Not, please avoid subsidies and unemployment benefits. We want to primarily focus on government spending on administration, um, uh, which is like the running of the government. Then you have public goods, merit goods, infrastructure development, spending on goods and services. So the way Bamford breaks it down is into two categories. Um, One is the government's current spending, and one is the government's capital spending. So just to simplify what they are, current spending is the administrative expenditure, operational expenditure. Capital is infrastructure related. So capital spending would be building a hospital. Okay. So this would be like building a hospital, and current spending would be the operational cost to run that hospital. राइट इसी तरह से आप एजुकेशन कर सकते हो इसी तरह से आप इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की बात कर सकते हो सो दीज आर टू टर्मिनोलॉजीज जो उन्होंने गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग के अंदर बात की है प्लीज अवॉइड सब्सिडीज एंड unemployment benefits and transfer payments and the free money basically okay फिर उसके बाद इन्होंने फिर और फर्दर सब कैटेगरीज में ब्रेक current spending and capital spending is basically exhaustive spending. The reason why I'm dealing with this is because 3 mark के 8 mark का जो 3 mark होता है, they can actually give you a question in which you might may require to answer 3 mark के लिए in terminologies. So ये जो हमारी है करंट स्पेंडिंग एंड कैपिटल स्पेंडिंग ये बेसिकली एग्जॉस्टिव के अंदर आती है right so it's considered exhaustive meaning the resources will be spent by the government on the decision of the government फिर उसके अलावा हमारे पास होती है नॉन एग्जॉस्टिव गवर्नमेंट की नॉन एग्जॉस्टिव this is basically government giving money to the people that you can decide how you want to spend this money. Okay, so इसके अंदर आप definitely transfer payments और इस तरह की आप चीजों को लेके जा सकते हैं because transfer payments क्या होती हैं unemployment benefits के government ने पैसे आपको दे दिए हैं and now you decide how you want to spend it. ठीक है, so that's actually part of non-exhaustive. Right. So this would be your government spending basically. Non-exhaustive के अंदर जो है you have interest payments on the national debt, you have state pensions, you have benefits. So at least you should have one example just in case if something like this comes. फिर उसके बाद you have the government spend taxation. Government की जो taxation की बात है first you might be required to even discuss the reasons as to why the government collects taxes, right? तो इसके अंदर आप actually you can break down कि कौन से वाले taxes की आप बात करें ठीक है, because remember we have two kinds of taxation that we discussed, the direct and the indirect taxes. अब जहाँ now this one is an important information that you should always know. हमने अभी तक बात की है डायरेक्ट टैक्सेस जो है वो इनकम्स एंड वेल्थ के ऊपर लगती है, राइट? इनकम्स एंड वेल्थ, इट रिड्यूसेस द पीपल्स परचेजिंग पावर and reduces consumer spending and businesses investment. So C&I falls as a result of that. Government can use this for raising taxes so they can spend on all these things that we talked about, the current and the capital and the transfer payments. Indirect taxes usually discouraging के लिए use होती है. These are imposed on goods and services. राइट, अभी तक माइक्रो के अंदर तो जब भी हम बोलते थे कि सिगरेट्स पे टैक्सेस लगा दो, तो वी वर टॉकिंग अबाउट इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस बिकॉज वो गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज के ऊपर लगते हैं, राइट? तो ये गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज पे लगते हैं, दे देयर पर्पस कैन बी टू डिस्करेज कंजम्पशन, or even like government raising money so that they can spend it on important public welfare. Let's say mostly it's all about public welfare. ठीक है. Then we also want to have a discussion on कि किस तरीके से government अपने fiscal stance रख सकती है. Now, when we talk about fiscal stance, we are basically looking at which direction the government is interested in taking the economy in. तो बेसिकली गवर्नमेंट के तीन स्टांसेस हैं जिसके ऊपर 12 मार्क क्वेश्चन आ गया रिसेंटली. One was whether the government is going for an expansionary fiscal policy, or is the government looking for a contractionary fiscal policy, or are they going for a balanced, right? अब इसमें है क्या? The three policies, as we've mentioned before, ये हमें बताती हैं कि what is the direction of aggregate demand we're looking for. If you're aiming for an expansionary fiscal policy, that means you want AD to increase. That means you want the government spending to rise and you want taxation to fall. Okay? Government spending rises, taxation falls. What happens as a result? G तो डायरेक्ट एडी को इफेक्ट करता है, सी प्लस आर प्लस जी, और टैक्सेशन जो है वो सी और आई को इम्पैक्ट करता है, और उसकी वजह से आपकी इकोनॉमी के अंदर चेंजेस आ सकते हैं. बट द की थिंग दैट वी really need to finalize in this is वो जो हम एडीएएस का डायग्राम बनाते हैं and how it affects our policies. Be mindful of your diagrams when you're dealing with macroeconomic objectives. We're dealing with ADAS diagrams with price levels on the y-axis and real output on the x-axis. AD right पे shift होगा, so this curve is going to shift to the right, something like this. We can call it AD1. And as a result, हम notice कर सकते हैं what has happened to economic growth, what has happened to prices, what has happened to employment. You complete the diagram and you show all these impacts. These are the key things that needs to be done in these essays. Now, obviously, the government is trying to control deflation by increasing the prices, or maybe they're aiming for increasing economic growth and employment, so they're going to use an expansionary policy. But if they're interested in contractionary policy, usually contractionary policy the government uses in order to control inflation. That's the primary purpose. So naturally, ऑपोजिट जाएंगे, गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग को कम करेंगे और टैक्सेशन को बढ़ाएंगे, जिसकी वजह से योर एग्रीगेट डिमांड इज गोइंग टू शिफ्ट टू द लेफ्ट. द रीजन व्हाई आई सेड कि ये सिर्फ और ज्यादातर सिर्फ प्राइस कंट्रोल करने के लिए होती है, because no government in their right mind would ever want to control economic growth or reduce economic growth and reduce employment. Usually it's the pressure of inflation because of which they have these policies. फिर उसके बाद बैलेंस्ड जो आपका फिस्कल स्टांस होता है, basically what you're aiming for is that government spending should be equals to the taxation. ठीक है. One added point, expansionary के अंदर you will go for something called a government budget deficit. A budget deficit actually increases AD, but sometimes the government may go for something called a surplus. When the government is aiming for a surplus, then AD falls, and that's how things are managed. Balanced, definitely. We need to know something about this balance budget. Because if a 12 marker is asking you to discuss कि क्या balanced budget, क्या all governments should aim for a balanced budget. So we do want to mention over here that, you know what, balanced budget is actually a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Number one, no need to borrow. And if there is no need to borrow, then there is no interest payments. So that's a very positive thing. Also, it sort of shows stability and good governance, good management of money, right? So when you look at a government which says that we don't need to borrow, we spend what we need, so that shows that that's a very stable government. That shows that that's a very intelligent government, good governance, not overspending, not going into debts, you know. Uh, but obviously, you have to know कि एक तरफ, when you have these two advantages about balance, it is not always a desirable one. For example, if the economy is in a recession, then a balanced budget is not the way out. Way out of recession is that you need to have an expansionary policy. But if you're in an economic boom where it's too inflationary and the resources are getting exhausted too quickly, so over there, a contractionary policy is a desirable one. So whereas we would say that balanced budget is a desirable one, but definitely it's not always the most desirable one, because a balance, sometimes you may need to fix your economic cycles. ठीक हो गया. अम, जब हम बजट के अंदर डेफिसिट की बात करते हैं, आई वुड लाइक टू ऐड टू थिंग्स ओवर हियर अगेन फॉर essay purposes. We're going to deal with those in an essay or two. One is they talk about government ka cyclical deficit, and the other one we need to write about is the government's structural deficit. Okay? जहां तक सिक्लिकल डेफिसिट की बात है, वी से सिक्लिकल डेफिसिट होता है जब आपकी इकोनॉमी जो है इकोनॉमिक साइकिल्स में वर्क कर रही होती है. समटाइम्स इट गोज अप, समटाइम्स इट फॉल्स डाउन, एंड समटाइम्स इट्स राइट द राइट प्लेस, देन समटाइम्स इट मे गो अप एंड सो ऑन. ये सिक्लिकल होता है. इसको मैं आपको एक डायग्राम के साथ एक्सप्लेन कर सकता हूं about the cyclical. That economy, जब हम देखते हैं in a period of time, what happens is that economy moves upwards in a cycle, something like this. This is how an actual GDP moves. But if you notice, there is a trend to it. ये trend हमारा potential होता है. Okay. Now, you can notice in this one that sometimes the economy goes above the potential and sometimes it goes below the potential and above and below. तो बेसिकली यहाँ पे हमारे बजट के साथ भी इसी तरह की कोई cyclical movement हो रही होती है. When the cycle is moving up, what we observe is that the government does not need to spend so much and they're earning a lot of taxation. So the government experiences a surplus. But when the economic cycle goes down, we realize that the government really needs to spend on people's welfare and they're not collecting much taxes also because the incomes are down. So we experience a deficit. But you would notice that after every surplus, there is a balance and a deficit. And then after every deficit, there is a balance and then a surplus. तो इकोनॉमी इस तरह से cyclically move करती है. So when an economy moves in this cycle, you have these budgets and deficits जिसको हम इतना स्ट्रेस नहीं लेते. The government does not worry about this cyclical deficit because it depends on the movement of aggregate demand and it depends on the economic cycle. Every bad cycle will fix itself again. So nothing to worry about. They worry about something called the structural deficit. This one is that even if your cycle is improving, you still have a deficit because you have certain set of spending that you need to do, which cannot be sorted out. It's because of the poor development in your economy, poor management in your economy. You have a lot of debt, you have to make payments. You have threatening neighbors, you have to spend on military. These are those spending that has to be done regardless. So cycle ठीक हो कि बुरी हो, you have to make these spending because a lot of people rely in your economy spending. तो ये आपकी जो है वो स्ट्रक्चरल है. इसका एक डायग्राम भी है. I'll deal with those in the coming essays. I won't deal with it right now. फिर उसके बाद there is another discussion about progressive, regressive, and proportional taxes. This is something that we do talk about all the time. जिसके अंदर, you know how when we're talking about our taxation, yeah, when we're talking about taxation, these direct and indirect, we do like to break these taxes into certain concepts like there is progressive taxation, there is something called regressive taxation, and there is proportional taxation. Okay? Progressive taxation basically tells us that as you get richer, you have to pay a higher average tax rate. So the richer you are, the greater the average tax rate you pay. And if you lose income, then this average tax rate falls on you. So it taxes heavily on the rich and lesser on the poor, more on the fair side. Regressive, on the other hand, is the richer you get, the average tax rate you pay on that good. Because remember, regressive usually is indirect taxes, and progressive is usually direct taxes. Okay, that's the link we made. So if income falls down, the average tax rate also, goes up. So it affects the low income people more. Just say, for example, petrol levy हो गया. So every liter the government gets about 84. Now the government has raised the prices even further up. Government is probably getting more money. So whether it's the rich or the poor, rich based on their income, The amount of tax they pay on petrol, percentage wise, it's a smaller percentage compared to their incomes. और वो ही पेट्रोल के ऊपर 84 rupees per liter on a poor person's income becomes a much higher percentage. So there's a bigger discussion that will be uh, made a little later on. Here you have the proportional, which says whether the income goes up or income goes down, the average tax rate remains the same. Um, that's called the proportional taxation. Then there is a discussion between the average tax rate versus the marginal tax rate. इसके ऊपर question आ चुका है. If you haven't done it already, we will solve a little later. But just to remind you, what is the difference between? The difference is average tax rate basically takes के आपने अपनी total income का कितना percentage जो है वो tax में pay किया है. It's the proportional, it's the percentage tax paid on the income. Okay. Marginal tax rate is slightly different. Marginal tax rate deals with the additional income that is being earned. So the richer you get, the higher your income becomes. So on every extra income that you generate, the government takes a particular um, tax percentage on that extra income earned. तो ये हमारा बेसिकली एक फिस्कल पॉलिसी का एक ओवरव्यू है. There are much deeper lectures that I have already given on this, which you can take a look at in the revision chapter. Much more details I've already done. I'm relying on the essays to basically cover this, which we'll deal with in